Our world is in desperate need of new stories. But where do we find them? How can we hear them? In what ways can we learn from them and allow them to shape our world towards something altogether more beautiful?
Perhaps the stories we need have always been here, resiliently present, echoing in the mountains which ground, flowing in the sweet rivers which give life. Maybe there are stories which are found in the land, and we need to explore new ways of knowing and being in order to hear and understand them.
Our world is in desperate need of new stories. Stories of hope, which demands justice in the face of ongoing global systems of oppression. We need new narratives which can help us imagine and dream. Stories towards the uprooting of a dehumanizing world order and the planting of new ways.
Perhaps the stories we are seeking are not new ones, but have been carried by our ancestors from generation to generation. Maybe they exist in the lived experiences and dreams of our grandmothers and sons, all those humans walking in a world not made for them, yet always pursuing better paths for them and their neighbors.
Come to think of it, maybe our world doesn't actually need new stories, or at least that is not where the story should end.
Perhaps what we need is a new world, and stories are part of its making.
Welcome to episode 7 of this collaboration between the Common Good podcast and the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
And this is Rashid.
And this is the closeout episode of this miniseries. Time has flown by.
It has.
And we thought as a reminder of what we've covered in this season, we'd look at the narrative arc.
Yeah.
So we did the welcome episode where we said hello and introduced ourselves.
Yeah.
And then the first guest episode was a grounding episode. So we grounded ourselves in story and place and in our bodies. And that was with Bongeka and Aphiwe.
And then we began exploring the importance of asking new questions. Our guests Ashley and Helene push us to stop plugging gaps and start asking why. They gave us tools to challenge economic isolation by starting with question.
Then we heard from Ncedisa, who spoke about the courage that's required to stop colluding with dehumanizing systems, even if that comes at personal cost.
And then Leila invited us into radical imagination, a world where any two people could sit at a table and have a conversation. And this idea reframes the structure of belonging not as something we build once, but as an ongoing orientation towards each other and toward future generations.
And then we heard from Charlie and Barry on a practical invitation to a literal table. They showed us what eliminating economic isolation and belonging could look like in practice over a meal that's messy and sustained and shared. And of course, you're welcome to revisit those episodes in their short forms in this mini-series or on our Liminal Space podcast platform for the longer form conversations. Rashid, having engaged with these stories now over the last 6 episodes, what are you thinking now? What has landed or resonated or stood out for you?
Yeah, so for me, I'm reminded of, again, how powerful stories and narratives are. I think of the quote of Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she said during a TED Talk in 2009, stories matter, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And yeah, this is a quote I've been sitting with for probably 2 years or so by now. It actually makes me think of the opening episode of this mini-series where we spoke about the power of stories and how they can help us access these liminal spaces, these places of in-between, which are useful spaces to process things, to ask new questions and to find new and better pathways. So for me, having gone through and reflected on these episodes, I'm grateful for the stories shared by our guests, which are rooted in their lived experiences, which are different to my own. As humans, we all have different lived experiences depending on our intersectionalities and positionalities and everything like that. So I think for me, what's been just so valuable is the idea that when I listen to other stories, how they can help me engage and consider and interrogate my own stories, including the narratives which continuously shape who I am and how I view the world.
Yeah. I mean, it was similar for me. I was struck again by this thought about how we tell our stories, tell stories in general. Often we characterize good guys and bad guys in a story and imagine that even that's a binary.
Yeah.
Sometimes that doesn't even exist in that kind of way. But I've been thinking about how I read myself into some of these stories as well. So especially when I'm telling the story about myself, I would always want to be the good guy. Like I position myself as I am the good guy. And what I've been thinking about is maybe to question some of that. Like, are there ways that I can critique the underlying assumptions to my own stories? And how do I do that? Like, do I have access to voices outside of the one inside my head? Or people who agree with me that can help me question those underlying assumptions. And maybe it takes courage to do that, or it's scary. At least it's scary to do that. But if what I believe is true, then it shouldn't be that scary, because no matter the questions that come, I'd be able to hold on to it. And so I've been thinking about that a little bit more.
Really cool. And obviously, I guess we should add that when we're talking about stories and narratives, we're not talking about like fairy tales, although they're also cool and amazing.
Yeah.
We're talking about stories, these foundational things that structure everything that exists.
Yeah.
So you can have a nation. What's the story of South Africa?
Yeah.
And that can be told from various vantage points in different ways. And it can also be weaponized in various ways.
Yeah.
Or the story of the US, the USA. What is that story? How is it told? I guess as well, even with things like religion or politics, there's certain stories and framing of stories, and like you were saying as well, in how you interrogating your own positionality in things, to also interrogate those stories. And just because that's what I was socialized into believing, is that actually real? Is it true? Is it harmful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe also from your quote from Adichie is like, there are multiple stories and multiple vantage points from which a story can be told. So if we take the story of Western civilization, we often get told in the global South here with us, we often get told that that is right and good and true.
Exactly.
And that we should accept it as that, where it's easier for us on the outside to go, well, maybe that isn't necessarily good or true.
Yeah.
There are at least some gaps that we can identify to doing, if we ask a question about like what is the right thing to do or what is a good thing to do. And so I think it's important for us to be able to question those things, which is what you can do at multiple levels, like you're saying. So at a personal level, I can do that about myself. At a nation state level, we can do that, but we can also do that at a very high level about the world in general and the state of the world in general.
Absolutely. And the fascinating thing is that TED talk that I spoke about, where that quote came from, it was actually called The Danger of a Single Story. That's the title of it. So it's that idea. So it's exploring, as we said a bit in the poem at the beginning of this episode, what are these other stories? Where can we find them? How can we find new ways of knowing them and of experiencing them?
You had a quote by James Cone that you wanted to share that talks about this idea of global South and global North. We started this podcast with the introduction by Joey, shout out to Joey, talking about why we are doing this collaboration and hearing voices from the global South, why that's important within the context of the Common Good Collective.
Absolutely. Yeah, so James Cone, he's a black liberation theologian in the US, and he's amazing. Love his work. And I think that he was going through his own liminal space in the late 1960s, because he was looking at the kinds of theologies that him and his people were kind of like facing and experiencing. And he began exploring this question of what does the gospel of Jesus Christ have to do with the black struggle for justice in the United States. And by that, looking at a theology that was beyond the status quo theology, which had justified, 400 years of slavery, dehumanization, and systemic oppression. So he wrote in the 1970s this book, A Black Theology of Liberation. And then in 1986, so quite a few years later, he wrote a new preface where he spoke about expanding the view of liberation beyond just his own context and lived experience, the things which directly affected him and his people. So obviously, in our context, we've been sharing stories from our own context and our own experience. And one of the things that he spoke about, which I find quite helpful, was he lamented at the time in the 70s, there wasn't like conversations around global south and global north. I mean, then they used to talk about the third world and the first world. Still people sometimes do today. And so he lamented this failure at that time to include a global analysis of oppression. And there's this quote from this preface in 1986 where he says that no one should be claiming to be doing Christian theology today without making the liberation of the third world from the exploitation of the first world and the second world a central aspect of its purpose. There is a connectedness of all humanity that makes the freedom of one people dependent on the liberation of all. No one can be free until all are set free. So I guess that reminds me of maybe even ideas of collective liberation as well, where it's not just about me and my people, but it's about us as humanity, which is a big story, but also a beautiful story.
Yeah. It's actually beautiful as well from your quote in one of the episodes we did about Ubuntu is a similar kind of idea that our liberation is also wrapped up into one another's liberation.
Absolutely.
And I thought it was also important to mention that we are telling stories from the global south or from a perspective in the global south, but we're not telling stories for the global south. It's not like we're a voice that represents everyone. The people we featured live in a very small geographic area, just Cape Town.
Yeah.
And even then it's limited to a couple of different areas within the city.
Yeah.
And so it's a nice exercise to listen to different voices, but it's not a monolith.
No.
And having said that, what I'm reminded of, especially with the guests we've featured in this series, is that actually here in Cape Town in particular, in South Africa as well, there's a lot of people doing beautiful work. They have brilliant ideas, but they don't have the resources to do it. And sometimes it feels like resources are gate-kept in the north.
Yeah.
And often even by those claiming to want to make a difference. So people would claim to be progressive or whatever language they would use. So it could play out, for example, when people give money to causes here, but they want someone like them to control the money. And so my question would be, why do you want to maintain power? And how is that different to any other system or organization that might want to control and maintain power? Like a multinational, it's no different to a for-profit company doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think about something a teacher of mine always says is that most of the great injustices in the world have happened or continue to happen because one group thinks that they can think better than another. And I think some of that is at play. Like, actually, can you trust those people on the ground in the global south to actually think well?
Yeah.
And actually, we can. I think people understand their contexts and knows what needs to happen. They just need the material resources to make that happen. So as we come to the end of this episode and this mini-series, we thought to finish with some reflection questions. Can we reframe the question of economic isolation in the context of the global North's exploitation of the global South?
What narratives have you believed about your own context and the world which need interrogating?
And how have these narratives caused harm and dehumanization? How can you replace them with restoring, rehumanizing narratives?
And how can you listen to, learn from, and be shaped by voices outside of your context, especially global South voices? Perhaps through music, movies, books, videos, podcasts, and stories.
Well, as we come to a close, with every eye closed and head bowed.
Are you going to do an altar call?
No. We'd like to say thank you to the Common Good Collective for doing this collaboration with us. It's been fun.
It's been great.
It's been really nice to work with you all.
Thanks as well to everyone for listening. It's been nice to have you.
And we'll see you somewhere on another podcast stream, probably.
Yeah.
But we also thought to leave you with a poem. And so please enjoy. Bye for now. How do we change a world? By changing a story, by starting the story, by telling a new story. Stories shift the world. They move us through progress, carry us beyond setbacks. Stories are poems of belief systems. If we can't get our stories straight, villains will be indistinguishable from heroes. Evil may look like good, or even worse, we will be stuck in the binary of heroes and villains. Everyone, one or the other, incapable of being both. Such is the power of a story, that it can motivate us to work together for something larger than us, or prefer radical individualism, with the self at the center of the world. Stories can shift us from complacency to action. They are places of refuge and safety, but at best they are places of courage and vulnerability. They are stories about why the world has to stay the same, and stories about why the world must change. Someone once said, "You can't kill an idea with a bullet." Stories make ideas come alive. They are the carrier medium. An idea can change a life, a community, a world. Shifting a narrative is the work the world needs. This world, hell-bound on imploding under the sheer weight of our existential dread. We need to hear new stories about new worlds so that we can become that. And that doesn't mean more stories of empire or colonizing distant planets. It's not about stories of the year after or make-believe. It is fantastical, hopeful, and not wishful. It is stories about this very earth, your very body. New stories about what becomes possible if we allow our wildest imagination to meet our grounded selves in a collective moment of liberation for all.